Okay. So let me just check live. All right, I think people are in the chat. I'm going to assume this is live. Nice. Okay. All right, so tonight I'm going to keep going with the Kalam debate prep. So going to stream every week between now and the 2nd of May, when I will do a debate with William Lane Craig again on the Kalam again. What I was doing the last couple of weeks was looking at the causal premise, and I suppose in a way what I should do is go through like in order of the premises, so premise 1 first and then premise 2 after that, etc. But I also thought it would be fun to look at this symmetry argument, and partly because it sort of recaps the discussion a bit. So as I'll explain in a minute, I'll explain the context in more detail. But I thought it'd be fun to sort of look at what Craig said in response to what I said, and then respond to what Craig said. Yeah, Rocky training montage. Absolutely. That's what we need right now. Okay, cool. So I've made a shitload of slides. And I think... what does share presentation mean? That's useful. Let's try that. We should have tried this out. That's not doing anything. Okay. Okay, cool. So hopefully that is showing. Kind of want there to be a little window that I can see. Okay, that'll do. Cool. So you can see me as well, I think. That's good. Okay, so basically, this is going to be the symmetry argument. So basically, the video starts here. Yeah, I'm going to look at the symmetry argument as it relates to Hilbert's Hotel, and we're going to look at Craig's 5-point response, and I'm going to respond to the 5-point response. So you might not know what any of this stuff is, the symmetry argument. Maybe probably know what Hilbert's Hotel is, but nevertheless, I'm going to go through it all in quite a lot of detail. I think I've got like 87 slides or something. Okay, so let's get going. Right, so slide 1, background. Okay, cool. So there's a little bit of literature. So in 2010, Wes Morriston published this paper, Beginningless Past, Endless Future, and the Actual Infinite, where I think that's the first time that we see the symmetry argument in the literature. So that's in Faith and Philosophy. And in the same issue of Faith and Philosophy, if you notice the page numbers goes 439 to 450, and then 451 to 456, there is a very brief response by Craig. So in the same journal, the same issue, like back to back. So you can read, I think most of Wes's papers are just available on his personal website, and for Craig's you can get he sort of reposted most of his papers on his website too. So you can read each of these things if you just Google for it. So they had a back and forth. Wes made the argument, Craig responds. A couple of years later, Wes published another, like a response to the response. But I don't think Craig published anything else on this argument directly since then. I mean, I haven't literally read everything that he's written, but I don't think there's another direct response to it. And then in 2020, me and Wes worked together on a paper on the symmetry argument again, so sort of 4th paper on this argument, where we were rounding up the various symmetry breakers, which I'll explain more as we go all these different proposals that Craig had given to sort of get around the argument. We went through all of them, all the ones we could see, and explained why we didn't think any of those worked. Then following on from the publication of that, I went on the Capturing Christianity YouTube channel and had this conversation with Craig. And then following that, down here in the bottom, there is, so in the debate, Craig said he had a 5-point response. I took it to be a 5-point response to this 2020 paper. And he didn't sort of go through all of the 5 points in the discussion. He went through, I think, maybe 1 or 2 of them. He said he didn't want to dominate the discussion by just going through his points, which is fair enough. But someone was curious and wrote into his, he answers questions on his website. And it's question number 679 or something. Someone asked him what the 5 points were, so he explained them. So that's what I'll use later to go through to respond to each of the 5. We'll go through each of them one by one, unpack what he's saying, give the relevant context, and then I'll explain what's wrong with it, basically. Because it's not going to be much of a spoiler to point out that they're all wrong. I think they're all wrong. So I'm going to just quickly look at the chat because I just want to make sure that, like, I'm so paranoid now of like doing a slideshow and it just not moving on. All right, I think we're good. So next slide. Okay, great. So what is this argument, right? This is basic, I suppose, but this is the Kalam cosmological argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And I'm just still paranoid because I think that's what happened last time. It's like, okay, whatever. I think we're good. So everyone probably watching this video knows what this argument is, but just for a bit of context, what we're looking at now is relates to the second premise. So normally Craig gives 2 types of defenses for the second premise. So he gives scientific arguments. So the second premise is the universe began to exist. So Craig sometimes defends that by appeals to scientific stuff, you know, the Big Bang interpretations of early universe physics and stuff. And also he buttresses those scientific arguments with philosophical arguments. So I'm not going to be interested in the scientific arguments. I'm only going to be interested in the philosophical arguments. So we're zooming in to the second premise and then the second set of defenses for that premise. And traditionally in his writing, he's given 2 defenses for this. So the first one I'm calling the Hilbert's Hotel argument, and the second one I'm calling the successive addition argument. Craig's names for them are a bit more of a mouthful, so sort of the impossibility of forming an actual infinite by successive addition, whatever. We just call them the Hilbert's Hotel argument and the successive addition argument. And here we're really not interested in the successive addition argument. We'll definitely come back to that a lot later. But we're just going to be sort of looking at the Hilbert's Hotel argument today. And even then, the symmetry argument doesn't actually refute Hilbert's Hotel argument. I'll explain the relationship, it's a bit subtle. But what we need to do is get a good grasp of what's going on in the Hilbert's Hotel argument. So I'm going to look at that first. So that's sort of 0.1 is running through this Hilbert's Hotel argument. And there's a lot of discussion about this online. I'm hoping I can give a pretty clear analysis of what's going on. I won't actually be critiquing the Hilbert's Hotel argument necessarily this evening. We'll come back to that another day, but I'm going to explain what's going on in this argument now. So here's the argument as Craig states it. So premise 1, remember this is an argument that's supposed to support premise 2 of the Kalam, which was that the universe began to exist. So this argument is supposed to support that premise. And this argument says an actual infinite cannot exist. That's premise 1. Premise 2 is an infinite temporal regress of events is an actual infinite, and then therefore an infinite temporal regress of events cannot exist. So let's unpack a sort of key term in this argument. So what does it mean? What is this term, an actual infinite? What does it mean? Well, it doesn't really matter what it might mean in all the possible philosophical contexts that you come across. It's not 100% nailed down. There's like obviously discussion in the literature about exactly the right way to think about this, but for our purposes and what we're going through here, we can sort of give a definition that's a bit like this. So a set or collection is actually infinite if and only if it has at least as many elements as there are natural numbers. So that's all we mean at the moment. So it's just saying that there's as many bits to a collection as there are counting numbers, so that's positive integers. As long as that's the definition, basically. So let's just look at premise 2. Why I think the premise 2 is true? Well, it is, so it says an infinite temporal regress of events. It's an actual infinite. So that, let's just look at it like this. So here's the now point on the right hand side. That's the sort of red moment. And going back in time to the left is a sequence of events. These are these grey circles. And the ellipsis at the far left just indicates that it just goes back forever. So you can think of these events as, say, days. You know, each is a distinct sort of consecutive chunk of time. Could be minutes, could be seconds, doesn't really matter. Point is that we can think of an infinite temporal regress of events in this way, and it's actually infinite if we can show that this sequence has as many elements as there are natural numbers. So the key idea here is to think about sort of pairing items in this collection with natural numbers like this. So it's called a bijection. So it's a certain type of mapping from one group to another, where we just say there's a one-to-one relationship. So it's a one-to-one correspondence between the set of natural numbers and this regress of events. So, and that's just, you know, a simple sort of pairing mechanism. Now, obviously, no one's actually pairing each of them, but the point is that you can establish that in this method you could keep going in principle, and what you would find is that for every event on this sequence you could pair it with a unique natural number such that there's no natural number left at the end of this imaginary process that wasn't paired with an event, and there's no event that wasn't paired with a natural number, so there's a one-to-one correspondence between the two. And that's it. That's just what it means for something to be actually infinite. Why I think an actual infinite can't exist? Obviously, this is where all of the sort of meat of the argument kicks in. So in order to understand why Craig thinks that this sort of thing can't exist, we need to pay attention to now a particular distinctive feature that actual infinite collections have. So picture here on the top, we've got the natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, etc., going off forever. And then underneath that, we've got the even numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, etc., going off forever. And what I'm doing is showing you that there's a pairing, one-to-one correspondence that you could make between those two collections in the following way. You could pair you could pair the first natural number with the first even number. You could pair the second natural number with the second even number. So you could pair 1 with 2, 2 with 4, 3 with 6, 4 with 8, etc., etc. And in this way, what you do is you establish that there is that both sets are actually infinite, right? So there's obviously as many natural numbers as there are natural numbers, so that set's actually infinite, and there's as many even numbers as there are natural numbers, so that set's actually infinite as well. So it just means that even though the even numbers are a proper part of the natural numbers, the distinctive feature that we are noticing here is that it can have a proper part can actually have the same cardinality as the whole, which is where all of the interesting stuff happens with this. So I want to just pause on this just for a moment, linger on this idea for a little bit. Ask yourself this question: are there more natural numbers than even numbers? Right. So it seems like a simple question. Are there more natural numbers than even numbers? A child could ask this question. They could understand what a natural number was, assuming you could explain that to them, which I'm sure they would be able to. Then, you know, you could ask this to sort of an intelligent 10-year-old and see what they think. I'm going to say that there's two ways to answer this question. And one way, there are more natural numbers than even numbers, and on the other way, there aren't more. There's the same amount. So what's the two ways? The first way to think about it, I'm calling a part-whole notion of quantity. So on the part-whole notion of quantity, then yes, there are more natural numbers than even numbers. What's going on here is that the part-whole notion of quantity just says something like if a collection A contains every element in the collection B, plus there's some elements in A that are not in B, right? So that's like, think about the natural numbers contains all of the even numbers, but in addition to the even numbers, it contains the odd numbers. So there's some numbers in the natural numbers, the odd numbers, which are not in the set of the even numbers. So if one set contains another one entirely, plus some additional stuff, then by this part-whole notion of quantity, it's a greater quantity. There's just more stuff in A than B, because it contains everything in B plus other stuff as well. So in that sense, there are more natural numbers than the even numbers. On the other hand, on what I'm calling a cardinal notion of number, then the answer is no. There's not more natural numbers and even numbers, because as I showed on the previous slide, you can pair them up one to one, and both of them are actually infinite. So there's in fact the same cardinality between both sets. So on the cardinal notion of number, no, the natural numbers are not greater than the even numbers. So what this shows us is that the part-whole notion of quantity and the cardinal notion of number are not the same as each other in the infinite case, right? They come apart, they drift apart from one another in that context. They are in agreement with one another when we think about finite cases. So like, if you think about just the numbers up to 10, right? And when we think about just the subset of those finite numbers, the even numbers between 0 and 10, there's 5 of them, right? And that means that they're a proper part of the whole. And also, it's not the case that they are the same cardinality as the whole. There's fewer. So both notions think that the even numbers up to 10 is fewer than the even numbers. They think that the even numbers up to 10 is fewer than the natural numbers up to 10. Right? They both agree in the finite case. In any finite case like that you pick, they're going to give the same idea. But obviously the whole point of this is that in the infinite case, these two notions come apart from one another. So let's look at this in relation to Hilbert's hotel. So this is a very crude picture that you could think of as representing Hilbert's hotel. It's just a load of guests effectively lined up in a line. And then first of all, observe that we can pair these up with the natural numbers. So there's a one-to-one correspondence between the guests of Hilbert's hotel and the natural numbers, and maybe that's just as simple as saying like this as the room numbers on the outside of the door on each room that they're staying in. So fine, there's an actual infinite number of guests in this hotel. But what happens when a new guest arrives? So there's a new guy over here on the left-hand side. Well, according to the part-whole notion of quantity, we've got now a collection of guests which contains the guests that were there a moment ago before the new one arrived. Plus it contains a new element, which is the new one who's arrived. So the set of guests that are in the hotel currently is greater than the set of guests that was in the hotel previously in the part-whole notion of quantity. On the other hand, we can just renumber these guests just by pairing them up with natural numbers again, and that means that in fact they're both an actually infinite collection, which means that the number of guests that was in the hotel before the new person showed up is equinumerous with the number of guests that's in the hotel after the new person has shown up. So in this sense then, we've got that coming apart of the part-whole notion of quantity and the cardinal notion of number. Another example, what if every other guest checks out? Let's suppose that every guest in the odd numbered rooms checks out of the hotel. Well, clearly now what's left is a collection of guests that is entirely contained in the collection of guests that was there a moment ago before every other guest checked out. So on the part-whole notion of quantity, there are fewer guests in this hotel. But equally, we can pair each of the remaining guests that's still left in the hotel with a natural number, and that shows that there's an actually infinite number of guests still in the hotel, even though half of them left. So the number of guests that was in the hotel before half of them left was infinite. The number of guests that's still in the hotel after that is infinite as well. So they have the same cardinality, so it's equinumerous. So once again, we see coming apart of the part-whole notion of quantity and the cardinal notion of number. So I think that's about as crystal clear as I can possibly make what's going on with Hilbert's hotel. Let's also look at it in relation to the temporal regress. So we go back to this picture where we've got the now point over on the right-hand side and a regress of events going off forever on the left-hand side. And we've numbered them all, we've assigned each one of them a unique natural number. Well, let's suppose like a moment happens, right? So we move on in time, the now point creeps somewhat to the right-hand side. And what that means is that the moment or the day or the second, whatever it was that we're tracking here, that used to be present, now it's in the past, right? So it's joined all of these other moments to be past moments. And that's just like a guest checking into Hilbert's hotel. So just like we saw a moment ago on the part-whole notion of number, we've got now a collection with this new event added to it, which contains the previous collection, right, as a proper part, but it's got an additional bit in it. So it's got something that the original one didn't have. And that means that on the part-whole notion of number, this is a greater collection than the previous one. But obviously, we can just renumber each of these elements and show that there's an actual infinite number of them again. And that means that there's, according to the cardinal notion of number, these two collections are equinumerous, right? So there's what I'm saying then is that as time passes, we can apply the same analysis that we did to Hilbert's hotel and find that even though we've just added a new moment to the stock of past moments, there's in fact the same number of them anyway, even though we've added a new one. So the part-whole notion of number and the cardinal notion, part-whole notion of quantity and the cardinal notion of number, giving us different results here. I'm going to just quickly pause and look at the chat, make sure I've moved on, we're all good. Okay, great. Not seeing any like immediate people telling me it's all. I think we can see the slides. We're good. I think it's going to take me years to not be paranoid about that. Okay, I'll pause in a moment and see if there's any questions or anything. So if you've got any questions, chuck them in the chat. If you really want me to answer them, you can put a super chat in there. Actually, if you like this, you know what to do. It's YouTube. You can subscribe and leave a comment or whatever. Unless you're listening to this to go to sleep with, in which case, just, keep going to sleep. All right, so we've gone through what the Hilbert's hotel sort of phenomena is. Now here's what Craig says about it, right? And this is in his Blackwell Companion long article, so it's like a 120-page long article written with Sinclair. And Craig says, Hilbert's hotel is absurd. But if an actual infinite were metaphysically possible, then such a hotel would be metaphysically possible. It follows that the real existence of an actual infinite is not metaphysically possible. So basically, Craig's saying that because things like the hotel was full, and there was a guest in every room, but it could accommodate new guests by just getting everyone to shuffle up and make room, or if half the guests leave, there's still just as many guests left. Because it has that type of behavior, because we're violating the part-whole notion of quantity, or at least we're pulling apart the part-whole notion of quantity and the cardinal notion of number, that those things are generating what he's describing as absurdities. He's saying, he uses the word absurd. It's not quite the same as saying that it's contradictory. Sometimes he sort of says that, but we're not looking at that now. We will look at that at some point. I'm going to do an entire episode just on the inverse transfinite operations, but we'll come back to that. Now we're just looking at this simple idea that Hilbert's hotel is absurd, and that's enough for Craig to say that such a hotel would be metaphysically impossible. Now I'm not going to complain about this. I'm just going to park this and not exactly engage with it today. We'll engage with it another day. But right now, we're just going to sort of put that out there and say, okay, that's what he's saying. The absurdity displayed by that pulling apart of those two notions I've been talking about so far. When that happens, well, basically nothing that concretely exists could violate the part-whole notion of quantity in that manner. according to Craig. Okay, so now I'm going to move into the symmetry argument. This is still background, by the way. So let's just be explicit what the symmetry argument doesn't do. First of all, what the symmetry argument doesn't do is directly challenge the Kalam argument. It's not a rebuttal to the Kalam. You could buy everything I say about the symmetry argument and still think that the Kalam argument is a good argument that proves that God exists. It doesn't directly even challenge the Hilbert's hotel argument. What I just showed you then, you could accept all of those premises, as we'll see in a moment. There's a challenge that involves Hilbert's hotel, but it's not directly saying, look, this premise in Hilbert's hotel is false for this reason. The dialectic is different. What it does is it challenges the consistency of Craig's beliefs. Not just Craig, but many people who share a cluster of views. And in particular, these three things are the things that it challenges. So first of all, Craig believes in personal immortality. So in particular, what Craig believes in, I take it to be something like this. As part of his religious beliefs, his theological commitments, Craig thinks that God offers a kind of solution to death, right? You basically don't die on Christian theism. Sure, the body dies, you're kind of dead for a bit, but really you become immortal afterwards, resurrected in a divine body or whatever. And what that means, I think, is that what you could do is say to yourself, I'm going to undertake the kind of hopeless task of enumerating each natural number one by one. And you'll get up to a certain amount and then you die. But then you kind of wake up in heaven or whatever, however the details of that work. Your conscious experience is reborn. And what you could do at that point is kind of pick up where you left off and keep counting through the natural numbers. So whatever else your experience is like when you're in heaven, it's a sequence of events, mental events in that sense. Right? So you could, in effect, have a continuous counting through natural numbers, one part of which began when you were in your earthly body and the rest of it carries on when you're in the afterlife. And because at that point you're immortal, God has saved you from death, it's a never-ending experience, so you could just keep going through the natural numbers forever. So that's one of the beliefs that this is going to start showing run into troubles with when you hold them all together. The second one, of course, is his belief that the past had a beginning. Now, he obviously believes that because, to be fair, I haven't actually brought up any evidence of his belief in personal immortality, but I'm sure I could find some if I went through some of his stuff. And I guess he's got a systematic theology coming out. Maybe there'll be something in that. Anyway, the second one is his belief that the past had a beginning. Now, we know that this is true because his life's work really has been defending the Kalam, and the second premise of that is that the past had a beginning. So he's definitely committed to that one. And as we just saw, this last one he definitely believes too, which is his belief that Hilbert's hotel absurdities suffice to rule out the concrete existence of an actual infinite. So basically, if you believe that you're if you believe in personal immortality, if you believe that the past had a beginning, so you're basically saying that the future doesn't have an end, but the past does have a beginning, and you believe that Hilbert's hotel absurdities, that distinction between the part-whole notion of quantity and the cardinal notion of number when they come apart from one another, whenever you see those types of things, that's sufficient to establish the non-existence of such an entity, that sort of metaphysical impossibility, then you're in trouble. That's the idea. So if you believe in two but not all of those, you're fine. If you don't believe in any of them, you're fine. The symmetry argument zeroes in on someone who believes all three of those things, and it poses a challenge to that person to say, how is it that those three things can be held consistently together, right? Okay, so, and the challenge runs like this. Let's refresh our memories of the original argument, right, which was an actual infinite. So premise one, an actual infinite cannot exist. We saw there's absurdities of Hilbert's Hotel is what Craig uses to establish that premise. Premise two, an infinite temporal regress of events, an actual infinite, where we can just number the events in an infinite regress and see that that's true. Therefore, an infinite temporal regress of events cannot exist. So that's the original argument. Now, what Wes and I did was sort of temporally invert that argument, which is a sort of pretentious way of saying I swapped one word of the argument for a different word. So the new version has the same first premise, an actual infinite cannot exist. Premise two, an infinite temporal progress of events is an actual infinite. And then three, therefore, an infinite temporal progress of events cannot exist. So this difference, in fact, is only swapping two words for two letters for three letters. So we're just distinguishing a regress from a progress. So the idea is that it's just saying if the future was infinite, then it would be an actual infinite. But if an actual infinite can't exist, then the future can't be infinite either. Right, so it's exactly the Hilbert's Hotel argument, which was pointed towards the past. We've just sort of like pivoted it round and pointed it towards the future instead. Now, this doesn't really matter too much, but in basic tense logic, there's an axiom, a symmetry axiom, which says something like, whenever you've got a tense logical argument, so an argument where it's got tenses in, and that's the tenses contribute to the validity of the argument. Whenever you've got an argument like that, then swapping the tenses systematically, future for past, will give you a mirror image argument. But if one of them is valid, the other one's going to be valid. So that type of systematic swapping of the tenses around won't make a valid argument invalid. It's sort of validity preserving, that type of swapping around. And in very simple tense logics, that's an axiom that's put in at the beginning. And I think the idea goes back to at least the medieval times. I think maybe William of Ockham. I wouldn't be surprised if it went back a bit earlier than that, but the medieval people were big into modalities and tense and stuff, so it's definitely stated there. Anyway, so there's a kind of geeky prima facie reason for thinking, well, if you think the first one's valid, you have to think that the second one's valid. Yeah. And anyway, in a sort of straightforward sense, it doesn't feel like if the first one's valid, the second one's making some kind of mistake in reasoning, just in terms of the structure of the argument or anything. So let's just see if we can justify the premises of the new argument. Just really quickly. This one's sort of it's not even worth spending too much time about it, but an infinite temporal progress of events is an actual infinite. Well, look, here's a picture. It's basically the picture we looked at before, but it's the other way around. So now the now point is over on the left-hand side, and we've got this progressive events going off towards the right-hand side. And, just like I did a minute ago, I can number them. I can pair each one of them off with an actual number. And that just means that, in terms of the cardinal notion of number, that this is an actual infinite, right? There's infinitely many of these moments in the future still to come. So it's obviously an actual infinite, no question about that. This is exactly the same as what we did when we numbered all of the past events. And I mean, the first premise is actually shared between the two arguments. So really, I don't need to justify this one independently because it's not a different premise. But let's see how it applies in this context, right? So premise one, let's just imagine that if you look at the picture, the now point is moving towards the right. So instead of this being like a guest checking into Hilbert's Hotel, it's like a guest checking out. So what we have is before the now point moves on, there's some collection of future events, and after it moves on one, say, day, there's another collection of future events. This later collection of future events is clearly contained in the earlier one because it's all of those plus, it's all of those minus one that's now present, which was future. So obviously on the part whole notion of quantity, there are fewer events left to go than there was a minute ago. Because a minute ago, there was all the events that are still to go plus another one. So it contained everything plus some additional bit. On the other hand, we can, as you can see here, we can renumber each of these future events. So even though part-whole notion of quantity thinks there's fewer events in the future, according to the cardinal notion of number, there's the same amount of numbers still to go. So this displays the same, exactly the same feature that the past infinite temporal regress of events displayed to us, which is the coming apart of those two notions, which is exactly the thing in Hilbert's Hotel that is the basis of all of Craig's grumbles about that. So whatever the merits are of that Hilbert's Hotel stuff, you know, park your nagging or niggling worries you might have about that. The point is just that it applies equally in both cases. At least prima facie, there doesn't seem to be anything in particular that's different here. They look the same. And if that's true, then both arguments seem to be like equally motivated, right? There's a kind of mirror image thing going on here, and there's nothing to tell between the two of them. On the other hand, let's bring out these arguments again. Craig definitely wants to say that the premise of the original argument is true. I mean, he puts this argument forward. He thinks all the premises are true in that first argument. In particular, he thinks that the conclusion of the first argument is true. But he doesn't think the conclusion of the second argument is true because, remember, he believes in personal immortality. So it can't be that an infinite temporal progress of events cannot exist, because that would just mean you're not going to be, no immortal afterlife for you. He could still believe that there's an afterlife. It would just be an afterlife where at some point you die in the afterlife and you're not then reborn again. You're just dead. Like actual death is there. And I think that, you know, you could bite that bullet. He could deny each of the three things I went through earlier, and I'll repeat them again later if you've forgotten already, but it was personal immortality, the beginning of the universe, and the Hilbert's Hotel absurdities ruling out an actual infinite. Those are the three things. So he could deny any of those three things, and this argument would go away. So he could deny personal immortality, and that would help because it would just mean he can accept that the premise of this second new argument, the conclusion of this new argument is true by giving up his belief in personal immortality. But I think that that's quite difficult to do, really, because in a sense that's the whole point of religion, right? It says me anyway, is to be a kind of consolation in the face of death. You know, don't worry, your loved one is up in heaven. Don't worry, you're going to live on in the afterlife. That type of thing. So fear of death is a big, you know, inextricably wound up with the sort of purpose and origination of religions. Quite difficult, I think, for him to say, all right, fine, you know, God isn't offering us proper salvation from death. He could do that, but I think it's tough. But if you recall, so if he wants to, you know, if he wants to have this denial of the conclusion, if there's not going to be a hope of finding some, you know, invalid, he's not going to find that the argument is invalid in the second version, given that stuff I was saying about the symmetry principle. And then the premise one is shared between them. It's the same premise in both cases. So he can't just give it up in the new version, but keep it in the original version. It's the same premise. So all he can do, the only thing you can do, is deny the second premise in the new argument. Right? So he's going to have to say an infinite temporal progress of events is not an actual infinite. And whilst maintaining that an infinite temporal regress of events is an actual infinite. And so now here, ultra clearly, you can see what I mean when I'm talking about a symmetry breaker. Craig needs to find some reason that premise 2 of the original argument is true, but the premise 2 of the new argument is false. Right? He has to find some reason, some way of denying that, some principle he can appeal to, which distinguishes that first premise from the second premise, or premise 2 of the first argument from premise 2 of the second argument. And that's the search for a symmetry breaker. And in me and Wes's paper, we went through a whole bunch of his different attempts to do that, because basically Craig doesn't want to give up any of those three things. He doesn't want to give up personal immortality. He doesn't want to give up the universe had a beginning, and he doesn't want to give up the Hilbert's Hotel argument. He loves the Hilbert's Hotel argument. So we went through a bunch of these attempts that Craig comes up with to find a principled reason for denying second premise of the future tense argument while maintaining the second premise of the past tense argument. So, for instance, the future is a potential infinity, not an actual infinity. If you ever heard Craig debating on the Kalam, you'll have heard him appeal to this notion, this Aristotelian notion of potential infinity. Sometimes he says the future doesn't exist. Sometimes he says that the future is pure potentiality, or that the future is not actual yet, kind of thing. Anyway, so in each of those cases, and others as well, we looked at them and explained why we don't think that those things work. So, that's all background. I don't know how long I've been talking for, probably ages, but let's get on to the 5-point reply. In fact, I guess I'll look at the chat, see if there's anybody still awake and in the chat. Okay, cool. Just gonna have a look, see if there's any like questions or say or anything in particular. Alright, I think we're all good. People are just chatting away, that's good. Question for later, do you plan to do the hidden Kalam premises, premise 3 and 4, get it from being? Okay, so this question is about basically what's sort of known as stage 2 in the literature sometimes. So like the Kalam conclusion is just that that the universe has a cause, and then that's the end of stage 1 of the argument, and stage 2 of the argument sort of picks up from there and says, you know, an analysis of the type of thing that could be that cause shows you that it has to be the type of thing that Christians believe in. I might do a bit on that. The thing is that Craig doesn't say very much about that in his published stuff, so there's not like a huge amount to go into, but yeah, maybe. Let's see. There's so much to go over anyway. I might get there. Right. Okay, good. So here, let's crack on with what we're looking at here. So we've got the 5-point reply. Okay, so now we're going into this bit of Craig's response. So this is what he brought up in his discussion with me. He had a 5-point reply, and it's what he wrote up on number 679, question 679 in his question of the week on reasonable faith. So you can go and look at that yourself. You know, please do, if you think I'm like misrepresenting him or something, go and check for yourself. I'm labeling them like this, so he doesn't actually give them like titles like this, but I'm saying that the first one is called It's Ad Hominem or Question Begging. Point 2 is Here's a Symmetry Breaker or two. Point 3 is him saying, well, what about Hedrick? Point 4 is him saying, what about Loke? 5 is him saying, well, what about Pruss? So I'll go through each of these and explain in a lot more detail what he's saying in each of them. And I'll unpack everything as much as I can to explain why I think none of these are particularly troubling. Right? Make your own mind up, obviously, but I'll explain from my perspective what's going on. So first of all, let's look at this point 1. It's ad hominem or question begging. So it's a big chunk of text on the screen here, but as you can imagine, because I've called this It's ad hominem or question begging, this is actually split up into like, it's one paragraph, but it's split up actually into sort of 2 points. And I think they're just distinct points. So I'm going to do them one by one. First one is sort of contained within this part of the text. So he says, as Alex recognized, the objection tends to be ad hominem, not in the abusive sense, but in the sense that it has force only against particular people, e.g. those who believe in personal immortality, or in the case of Andrew Loke's formulation of the argument against theists. I mean, let's just be clear, there's this notion of ad hominem, which is that kind of fallacy sort of thing where it's something along the lines of like saying, this guy is an idiot, therefore what he's saying is wrong. And that inference is fallacious because an idiot could be right about something, so it doesn't mean that they're wrong just because they're an idiot. Or this guy's ugly, so he must be saying something wrong, that type of thing. It's an ad hominem in that sense, where, I mean, sometimes people just think it's an insult is an ad hominem. Not really, just saying you're ugly or you're an idiot isn't an ad hominem, that's an insult. An ad hominem is an inference that's fallacious. And Craig is, not saying that that's what's going on. He said it's not in the abusive sense like that. It's an ad hominem, and this is a kind of like, normal philosophical usage of this term, although it's, the normal usage on the internet is certainly as a kind of fallacy one. It's just a classification of a type of argument, right? It's like saying, you've said this, you've said A, you've said B, and you've said C, but A, B, and C are not jointly consistent. So which one are you going to deny, kind of thing? It's that type of argument. And as I explained already, I've given you the three things. Craig has to deny one of those three things, right? Or find a symmetry breaker. So, yes, it is ad hominem in that sense, right? It's not directly a challenge to the Kalam cosmological argument as such. It's not just against those who believe in personal immortality. It's those who believe in personal immortality and that the universe had a beginning, and that the Hilbert's hotel absurdities suffice to rule out an actual infinite existing in concrete reality. So far, yes, and Craig believes in those three things: personal immortality, past had a beginning, and Hilbert's hotel absurdities rule out an actual infinite. He does believe in them, so it is an ad hominem in that sense, and it applies to him. So he needs to say more than just that it's an ad hominem, because just saying that just is like a classification of the argument. It's like saying, well, this is a modus ponens. Yeah, and what? What's our response? So at this point, there's just no objection here. Just saying it's ad hominem in this sense is not an objection to it. And he goes on, and I think this is a little less clear, really, but I'll read this out. If one tries to avoid this ad hominem feature by claiming that it's clear that the series of future events can be infinite, then one seems to beg the question. For the objection does nothing to expose a flaw in the reasoning in support of a beginning of the series of past events. It allows that there is a sound argument against the infinitude of the past that also applies to the infinitude of the future. Without refuting this argument, it just assumes that an infinite future is possible, which begs a question against the argument. So the objection is both question begging and or ad hominem. So I think what's going on in this is, let's consult the beginning of the sentence of the passage again. If one tries to avoid this ad hominem feature, why would you want to avoid the ad hominem feature, right? It's not because being ad hominem is bad. You might want to avoid the ad hominem feature in the sense that you want to make the argument even stronger, right? By saying it's not just these people that you have to worry about, it's just that the premises are true or something, and then everyone has to worry about it, something like that. So I think he's saying if you want to avoid this by saying that it's clear that the series of future events can be infinite, then it seems to beg the question. I'm not 100% sure what he means here. I think it's just quite difficult. I've read this about 50 times and I sort of wander around trying to figure out exactly what's going on. But I think what he's trying to say is something like this. Imagine you made this type of argument. I'm trying to think of an argument where the first premise is that it's true that the future is at least possibly endless, right? So imagine you argued like this. If, premise one, the future is possibly endless. Premise two, if it's endless, then it's actually infinite. Premise three, so actual infinities are not impossible, because if something is possible and actually infinite, then it's possibly actually infinite. So actual infinities are not impossible. Then the conclusion would be, so beginningless past is not impossible, right? Because just because it's an actual infinite wouldn't mean it's impossible anyway. Something like that. I'm not making that argument here anyway. This isn't the symmetry argument I've been talking about so far. It's just a different argument. I think I probably do agree with this argument anyway, but it's completely independent of this. It's irrelevant when evaluating the symmetry argument. I quite like premise one. I don't know that it's endless, but it seems like with these possible. Yeah, why not? I think if something's endless, then it's actually infinite, because I like this notion of the domain principle, which we'll come back to another day. And I'm not as scared of actual infinities as someone like Craig, so I'm not even sure I worry about premise three. And a few weeks ago, I was putting an argument forwards to the effect that the past is beginningless. So obviously, I'm not worried about premise four. So in particular, I'm kind of okay with this argument, but I'm not making it now, and that isn't needed to run the symmetry argument. So if Craig is saying that someone who ran this argument was begging the question, maybe, I don't know, maybe, but like I don't need to make this argument here in order to push the symmetry argument. So even if this argument begs the question, this argument that's on the screen right now, even if that does beg the question, it's no help to him. It's not a reply to the symmetry dilemma that he's in. And I mean, it just seems strange to say if we try and avoid the ad hominem feature by claiming it's clear that the series of future events can be infinite. I mean, he's the one who thinks that. He's doctrinally, sort of theologically committed to the claim that the series of future events can be infinite, at least endless. So he has that as a doctrine. I don't really have any doctrines in that sense. I'm not like a member of a religion in the same way that he is. So, I mean, he's much more strongly committed to that claim than I am. So it just seems a bit weird to sort of hoist that on me when it's his belief. Anyway, even if I'm sympathetic to it, it's sort of his belief. He should own it. But anyway, so I think that, sure, if it's an ad hominem, but that's just a label, that's not actually an objection, and maybe someone's begging the question somewhere, but like I'm not doing that here, and there's no way, you can't say that the person who runs the symmetry argument is begging the question, because like the argument that if I'm right in interpreting that passage anyway, that's just nothing to do with the symmetry argument. It's a different argument. So I don't think there's nothing in this first objection. Like it's not really an objection. So let's move on to the second bit. There's a bit more to unpack here. The first part of this I'm calling "There are no future times," for obvious reasons. Because Craig says this, and basically in the next paragraph, he says, on a tense theory of time, according to which temporal becoming is an objective feature of reality, there are no later events than the present event, and hence no future events. So a tense theory of time entails that an actually infinite number of events does not exist. Indeed, the number of future events is zero. So, I'm going to bring up the objection that we gave in the paper, but there's a really obvious objection that you might want to point out here as well. So Craig is saying, he's saying on a tense theory of time, according to which temporal becoming is an objective feature of reality. Okay, on a tense theory of time, what that means is that like tenses, saying that this will be and that was or whatever, that they are real. They're parts of the fabric of reality itself, and they're not to be sort of paraphrased away into language that doesn't have tenses in. So a tense theory of time sort of takes tenses to be real. It goes back to Arthur Prior in the 60s. Obviously it has got medieval roots, but like the contemporary version of this idea goes back to Prior's work in the 60s. Now, strictly speaking, that's different to the question of the ontology of past and future times, right? Because that's a distinction. So the tense theory of time is like the A theory, which is where tenses are real, as in the B theory, where tenses are sort of explained away in terms of earlier than and later than relations instead. But neither of them necessarily tells you that there's no future events or no events later than the present. That's a different sort of orthogonal distinction, which is between eternalism and presentism. So eternalism says all times exist equally, past, present, and future are all real, they all exist in the same sense, whereas presentism says only the present moment exists, and past and future moments don't exist. So I guess maybe you can say that you can't be a presentist and a B theorist. It'd be a bit weird, but maybe that's not even true, because there's a theory called the moving spotlight theory, where you kind of picture the B theory as a kind of timeline, but there's like a spotlight that's moving along it that's illuminating just one part at a time, and you interpret the spotlight being existence, real existence, whatever. Anyway, the point is there's combinations of these things, and they're not strictly speaking the same. This tense theory of time doesn't necessarily entail presentism, but anyway, whatever. It's presentism, the commitment to presentism, which says that there's no future events. But presentism also says that there's no past events because it says only the present exists. So it would be a bit of a weird way of trying to establish a symmetry breaker to say, well, on presentism there are no future events. Because sure, on presentism there's no past events. So if it gets you out of the Hilbert's Hotel issue with respect to the future, then it does so with respect to the past as well. Presentism is not a sort of solution here. And the reason it's not really a solution is because it's a theory of the ontology of time that's symmetrical with respect to the past and the future. And what we need is a symmetry breaker. We need something that's not symmetrical. So it wouldn't help just to appeal to presentism. And indeed, Craig's defended presentism in the literature. What he could do, I guess, though, is, and that's why I'm not really, even though I've just explained all of that, it's not really the point I wanted to make here, because Craig could just say, well, you know, forget presentism, then let's go with the growing block theory, which is another sort of asymmetric theory which says that the past and the present are real, but the future is not real. Now, that does introduce an asymmetry. Okay, so he could, let's just suppose he goes with that. And that's what he means here. So instead of just hearing him say on a tense theory of time, we're hearing him to say on the growing block theory of time, according to which the past and the present are real, but the future isn't, then there are no events later than the present event. Okay, fine. Let's interpret it in that way. Okay, so what's the problem with that then? Well, it seems like Craig's one step behind in the dialectic, because we already responded to this exact symmetry breaker proposal in section 3 of our paper, which is called something like "What if the future doesn't exist?" So even a presentist would distinguish between the following two sentences, right? We say this is the last moment of time, and this is not the last moment of time, right? But the presentist, in order to be able to make that distinction, like, so what's the difference between them? Well, if the last moment of time just means that, like, you know, time ends just right after this very second, right now, there's no more time to come. Fortunately, it didn't, right? It carried on. So if I'd said this is the last moment of time now, oh, I was wrong, that was false. And saying this is not the last moment of time, that would have been true, because it wasn't. So they want to maintain a distinction like that because it's very intuitive and straightforward. It seems to be tracking a real distinction there. But in order to be able to do that, what they have to say is something like, you know, even though there aren't any, you know, currently, right now, there are no future times, because only the present exists, or only the present and the past exists. They still have to say, well, you know, that there isn't now, but there will be future times, right? So it's the simple kind of doctrinal commitment to the future not existing that a presentist or a growing block theorist has doesn't mean that they don't think that there, you know, it doesn't mean that they think there won't be any future times. It just means that they think there aren't any, right? Which is a reasonably subtle but clear distinction. And in fact, Craig makes this distinction himself. So this is a quote from his book, Time and Eternity, Exploring God's Relationship to Time. He says thus, it's on page 148, thus, there really are no past or future events. So this is presentism, not growing block theory, even stronger view. But then he says, except in the sense that there have been certain events and there will be certain others, right? So, I mean, he's admitting the distinction. I mean, admitting, it's not like a got him, it's an obvious distinction. Everyone wants to admit that. But it's just, he says it himself. But given that he's allowing the room, the freedom of speaking to be able to say things like there will be future events, well, if his belief in personal immortality is true, how many future events will there be, right? I want to know, can I number the future events, the ones that will be, the ones that currently don't exist but will exist? Could I pair each one of them with a natural number? Because if I can, then there's actually infinitely many of them. So it's not a way of escaping the symmetry between the past and the future that's relevant to this argument. Because at the end of the day, it's just like he's saying, I would rather you asked me the question in a tensed way. And I'm quite happy to do that. How many future times will there be? Right? Still, that's not, he's not. So the original thought was he just said, well, there are no future times. Great. How many will there be? That's what we asked in the paper already. So replying to what we said in the paper, which is, even if you say there are no future times, how many times will there be? He's not even responding to that. It's like he hasn't actually read what we said in the paper, because he wouldn't just repeat the thing that we responded to already. He would respond to the thing we said, you'd think. So it's like it's almost like he forgot what we said, or maybe he didn't read it, or he didn't read it very carefully. But obviously, if you say A and I say, well, hold on, here's a reason to think not A, and then you just go, well, A, that's not a dialectic. You're just repeating the thing. You're not engaging with what I said about why there's a reason to think not A instead. So it's just it's a step behind in the dialectic. And clearly, it's not an objection to what we said in the paper, because we addressed this in the paper. So he should respond to what we said rather than repeating himself. So here's a symmetry breaker or two, part 2. So he just runs on in that paragraph to the second point, which is the future is a potential infinite. So he says, the series of events later than any event in time, including the initial cosmological singularity, is always finite and always increasing towards infinity as a limit. In other words, such a series is potentially infinite. And as I said, anyone who's watched Craig discuss this argument in the past, a lot of people have watched him discuss this because he's discussed it a lot. He wrote his book in 1979. It's getting on for 50 years ago. This exact idea is in the book. It's in the Craig and Sinclair article as well. It's one of his main ideas about how this works. So you're probably familiar with it if you're in any way familiar with any of this stuff. Okay, but this is like just straightforwardly wrong, and I think I can just explain in a really super clear way why this doesn't work and why this is wrong. So Craig's idea is that the endless future isn't actually infinite. It's not an actual infinity. Instead, it's a potential infinity. And what he means by potential infinite, so remember I said to you that an actual infinite is just a group or collection that has as many items as there are natural numbers. That's it, simple definition. Potential infinite's a bit more, slightly more subtle. It's a collection, or I can't really sort of set, but it's a collection of things that's always finite, but increasing towards infinity as a limit. So it's like growing. It's always finite, but it's increasing in number, and while it will never stop increasing, but at the same time it will never actually be anything other than finite. So it's got infinity kind of in the distance as a thing it's aiming towards, but it's never going to get there. And he thinks that if he can say the past, a beginningless past is actually infinite, but an endless future is only potentially infinite, then that's a symmetry breaker, which will allow him to deny the second premise of the future tense argument while endorsing the second premise of the past tense argument. Okay, now again, he's kind of just repeating what he's said in print without responding to what we said in the article. So as a response to me and Wes's paper, it's kind of a step behind the dialectic again. This time we addressed it in section 2, which is called something like, what if the future is a potential infinite? So not cryptically, you're not hiding the ideas, we're trying to be as clear as possible with it. So I don't know why he didn't respond to what we said there. But what we said there, I'll explain this now. First of all, just the intuitive thought here, intuition pump. Craig's obviously wrong, right? Obviously wrong. The future doesn't increase. It's not always finite, but increasing towards infinity as a limit. The future is not doing that. Think about in the finite case. So let's suppose that it's actually the case that in America there will be 10 more presidents before the economic contradictions of the capitalist system finally overcome democracy and it collapses in as an anarchistic whatever, something like that. And at the end of the United States happens in 10 presidents' time. Now, what happens is the next president who gets inaugurated, at that point, there are now 9 future presidents that are yet to come. When the next one gets inaugurated, there are 8 future presidents yet to come. So in the finite case, as time passes, rather than the future remaining finite but growing towards infinity as a limit, what's going on is that the future is decreasing, shrinking. Right? One thing stops being future, becomes present, goes off into the past, and there was only finitely many things in the future in this assumption and finite case. So it's just shrinking. Right? There was 10 presidents, now there's 9, now there's 8, soon there'll be none. So the number's going down, it's not going up. Well, what about in the infinite case? Suppose that America never collapses under its own economic contradictions and whatnot, and there are an endless series of presidents, one after the other. Well, what happens when the next president gets inaugurated? Well, we could just renumber the presidents yet to come and find that there's still an actual infinite number of presidents left. We could pair each one with a natural number and find none left over. So, in the infinite case, as time passes, the number of events left to happen is the same. It doesn't change. It doesn't go down. It goes down according to the part-whole notion of quantity, but it stays the same according to the cardinal notion of number. But in no sense does it go up. It doesn't increase towards infinity as a limit either. So he's just blatantly wrong there, right? It's complete. It's backwards. It's upside down, inside out, wrong. So why is Craig making such an obvious blunder like this? How could he have talked himself into a point of view of thinking that the future increases over time rather than decreases or stays the same, when it's so obviously clear that that's right? Well, in his article with Sinclair, he says this on page 116, for as a result of the arrow of time, and then this is what you need to pay careful attention to, the series of events later than any arbitrarily selected past event is properly to be regarded as a limit. So I've drawn this picture on here. So the grey event towards the left is an arbitrarily selected past event. It could be like the day you were born or something. And then the red circle represents the now point, which on this tense theory of time sort of slides along the timeline towards the right-hand side. And then this series of events that's properly to be regarded as a limit is like the number of, it's the interval between those 2 points. Right? So the idea is that as the now point slides across towards the right-hand side, the interval between that fixed, arbitrarily selected past event, your birth, let's say, and the now point just grows as you get older. So your age is just a measure of that finite interval between a fixed point in the past and now. And guess what? You keep getting older, buddy. That's what happens, right? It's always a finite number, your age, but it's going up. And as time passes, it gets bigger and bigger. And as time passes in general, the interval between a fixed point in the past and the moving now is going to grow and grow and grow. And that is a potential infinite. That's just growing and growing and growing. There's no limit. The moving now is just going to keep going if the future is endless. So it's going to be some finite number that is the value between those 2 points. But it's growing as the now moves, and it's always finite, and it's growing towards infinity as the now point rolls off towards the right-hand side of this infinitely long line. Okay, but that is an interesting observation, but also completely irrelevant, because the whole point of this is what we're interested in is this interval, right, which is on the right-hand side of the now point, because now is now, and the future is everything that's in front of that, towards the right of that. What Craig's doing instead is talking about the duration of a specific part of the past, right? So it's behind the now point, it's to the left of that, it's in the past, between some fixed past event and now. That notion, that amount of pastness is growing, like your age. What does that classify? It classifies how much time you've already spent on the earth, right? Whereas clearly the relevant question here is, if the future is endless, how many events will there be? And I'm saying you can number them, and there's the same amount as there are natural numbers, so there must be actually infinitely many of them. And that just means that, like, Craig is not talking about the right thing. And I think, move on to the next slide. I think, when considered correctly, the right thing to say is that Craig's changing the subject, right? Because if the relevant issue is how many future events will there be, and he says something like, well, between a fixed point in the past and the moving now, there's only a potentially infinite amount of time. That's true, but that's kind of just like, so what, right? If I say, what's your house like? And you say, well, the house next door is nice. That's not answering my question, that's changing the subject. And I think that the right way to think about it is that what he's saying is something like a future perfect tense. He's saying, at the arbitrarily selected past event, at your birth, let's say, how much time will have passed, when the moving now has got to like this point in time? And the answer will be some finite amount. But that's just like, at some point in the past, how much future is there between that moment and the moving now? That's still behind the moving now, it's still past. At best, it's future perfect from the point of the fixed point in the past. But because it's talking about the number of events that will have taken place, it's a future perfect tense construction, when the relevant question was just, right now, how many future events will there be? Just simple future tense. Not from some fixed point in the past, how many events will have been at some point, one time, blah, blah, blah. So it's just changing the subject. And also, it's kind of not incompatible with the claim. The two claims are not incompatible, right? Let me just go back a slide. You think about it here. I mean, I think I'm quite within my rights to say, look, the interval on the right-hand side is actually infinite. The interval on the left-hand side is potentially infinite. They don't even overlap. They can coexist. How many future presidents have there been? Whatever, 44 or whatever. If time never ends and America never collapses, how many will there be? Infinitely many. Just because the number that have been is going to increase without limit and is potentially infinite, doesn't mean that the future is not actually infinite. So it's not even incompatible with the claim, it doesn't even rebut the claim. So it's almost like a bait and switch. I don't know if he's doing it on purpose. I guess he's not doing it on purpose. I actually think it's like a being held captive by a picture or something. I think he's just in this frame of mind. He can't duck rabbit himself into seeing what the question actually is. Anyway, that's as clear as I can possibly make this, I think. If you still don't know what I'm talking about, I am a failure as a communicator, because I can't explain this any better. Needless to say, even if I'm wrong, Craig isn't addressing what we said. There's an analysis of what happened. All of that is said in the paper. He doesn't address any of that. He doesn't say, well, they say this, but they're wrong about that. He just repeats the thing we're critiquing as if we didn't say it. So plainly then, even if I'm wrong, what he's doing isn't addressing what I'm saying. If I'm wrong, tell me what was wrong about it. But he's just not saying anything about it. He's just like acting like it never happened or something. Last bit on this. He says, consider Alex's premise. If a beginningless series of past events is impossible, then an endless series of future events is impossible. This commits Alex to the view that there is no possible world in which the series of events has a beginning but no end. In other words, he has to say that the view that the series of events is potentially infinite is not just false but impossible. And that is a radical thesis carrying a heavy burden of proof. I'm not trying to do a Craig impression, but it's just, reading it as it sounds to me as I read it in my head. So there's a premise there. He's written number 1 next to it. He's written, if a beginning a series of past events is impossible, and an endless series of future events impossible. I haven't said that tonight. It doesn't come up in the paper with me and Wes. It's not strictly speaking. I don't know where he got it from. So that's not my premise. Where did this come from? On the other hand, I think I can sort of see what's going on. And I think what's going on is he's forgetting the dialectical context to some extent. It's almost like he's forgotten that there's an antecedent in the background of this. What I'm saying is, if you think that the Hilbert's hotel absurdities are sufficient to rule out the infinite past, right? Just because when a new event gets added to the past, that's like a guest joining Hilbert's hotel. According to the part-whole notion of quantity, there's more events in the past, but according to the cardinal notion of number, there's the same. If that's enough to rule out the infinite past, then, absent a symmetry breaker to overcome the prima facie plausible-looking symmetry argument, you should think that the Hilbert's hotel absurdities also rule out an infinite future. Like, that's what I'm saying. And I think that I can say this without it meaning that I'm saying there couldn't be a universe that was asymmetrical or whatever it was that he thinks I'm saying. Let's go back and get that right. He's saying this commits Alex to the view that there's no possible world in which the series of events has a beginning but no end. Right? I'm not actually saying anything about the structure of space-time because I don't buy the antecedent anyway. Right? I don't think the absurdities of Hilbert's hotel rule out an infinite past. We're playing along for the purposes of this argument, right? Point is, he does. So he needs to provide a symmetry breaker in order to be able to treat the future different from the past. His problem, not mine. I think, though, that in the debate, when I talked to him directly about it, he brought that up, and I may have got myself confused or something, and maybe at least given him the wrong impression of what my view was. So maybe this is all confusion based on my part, but I think maybe actually he'd already written this at the time and he said it and I didn't think quickly enough. But anyway, however we resolve that notion, whether I was an idiot on the day or not, I clearly deny the antecedent of this, so I don't have a heavy burden that requires justifying or something. I've given the symmetry argument, and I did justify the premises for you just a moment ago. I feel like I've discharged my burden for the things that I'm actually arguing for. And here, at best, I'm arguing for a conditional where I don't even buy the antecedent. So anyway, I think here he's just not right again, basically. One step behind in the dialectic, not responding to what me and Wes actually said. Let's pause for a second and have a look at the chat. Just seeing if there's anything directed for me. It's nice to see people chatting in the chat. I'm not going to adjudicate anything here. I think this is Richard Carrier saying, it's another way of putting it that if infinity is the limit of a process, even if the limit has not yet been reached, it must still exist relevantly. Sorry, let me put that back on. It must still exist relevantly, otherwise the series must end. Yes. So this is going back to what I said a moment ago about the domain principle. So Cantor, in a letter to Dedekind, I think, in like 1879 or something, at one point, changed his mind later, but at one point advocated for that idea, which is that like you could have a variable infinite, like a potential infinite. So it's a variable that can take on a series of values from a range of values. But Cantor's idea at that point was that if it can take any value, if it's potentially infinite, it gives an endless series of, if the series of values that it could take is infinite, then it just means that like that series on its own must be actually infinite, right? Even if the potential infinite kind of slides back and forwards endlessly on top of that range, the range itself must be actually infinite. And so yeah, that's exactly the idea. And Graham Priest is sympathetic to that too. Like I said, I think Cantor changed his mind on it, but it's, whatever. Seems right to me, from what that's worth. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit here. His third point. What about Hedrick? So this is the next thing that Craig brings up. He says, Landon Hedrick, himself no friend of the Kalam cosmological argument, has offered a version of the argument for the finitude of the past that's not susceptible to the symmetry objection. This version of the argument for the finitude of the past avoids any alleged parallelism with the future. Okay. So this, what he's referring to is my friend Landon Hedrick published this paper in Religious Studies called Heartbreak at Hilbert's Hotel, maintaining the tradition of philosophy papers about Hilbert's Hotel that have some kind of pun in the title. And the argument that he proposed, and he's not an advocate of the Kalam. He was proposing this argument in order to, analyze it and go through some stuff related to it. But he said this: premise one, there cannot be a world in which an actually infinite number of things have been actualized. 2, if the actual world is one in which the universe is past eternal and is beginningless, then there is a world in which an actually infinite number of things have been actualized. Premise 3, therefore the actual world cannot be one in which the universe is past eternal. So remember, Craig says about this argument that it's not susceptible to the symmetry objection and it avoids any alleged parallelism with the future. Okay, you could say that, I guess, but let's just think about it for a minute. Here's the original argument above and a new version of that argument below. I've highlighted in red where I've changed the tense from past tense in the above argument to future tense in the below argument. So instead of saying there cannot be a world in which an actually infinite number of things has been actualized, I say there cannot be a world in which an actually infinite number of things will be actualized. Might as well just change have been to will be. Same in premise 2. Instead of past eternal, I say future eternal, which just means instead of beginningless, it means endless, right? So I am systematically changing tenses in the argument, and we do produce exactly the same type of symmetry objection. I mean, it's this: you can change the tenses in this argument, and if the first one rules out a beginningless universe, the second one rules out an endless universe. Like, I don't understand what he was thinking. Why think that they couldn't? Did he even try to swap the tenses around in them? I don't know, but to me it just seems like straightforward. Yes, you can. What are you talking about? It certainly doesn't explain anything about why or what's wrong with this new version of the argument. So I, in short, have no idea why he thinks this isn't susceptible to a symmetry like retensing. It just seems like it blatantly is. But anyway, look, so what, right? Let's suppose he was right. He is obviously not right about that, but let's suppose that he was right, and you just couldn't, you try and rewrite the tenses and your pencil breaks or whatever, and there's no way of doing it. Fine. So what, right? Because how would that help with the trilemma? Which, if you recall, he has to say, he can't say all three of these. The past has a beginning. Hilbert's Hotel absurdities rule out an actual infinite, and the future is endless, unless he's got a symmetry breaker. Because how is he denying the second premise of the symmetry or the original symmetry argument? Right? Just saying, well, you can't retense Hedrick's argument. That doesn't tell me which of these he's denying. Right? It's not a symmetry breaker itself. There's not a reason to think that premise 2 of the symmetry argument was false. Just because you can't retense Hedrick's argument, it doesn't mean premise 2 of the original symmetry argument is not true. So it's irrelevant. At best, it's irrelevant. At worst, it's wrong. I just don't know how this could be. I don't know how he's... it's troubling to think how... I might be a complete fool because I can't understand what's going on here unless it's just that he's blundered. One of us is blundered. But it seems perfectly clear to me. Even if he was right about this, it does nothing to address the trilemma. So I think what's going on is that Craig isn't seeing the dialectical context clearly enough. And or maybe what he's saying is, all right, I'll give up point 2 here. Maybe what he's saying is, I'll throw away the Hilbert's Hotel argument because I can use Hedrick's argument instead. And that apparently can't be retensed. So if that was right, I would appreciate it if he could clarify that by saying, I hereby renounce the Hilbert's Hotel argument, in order to keep believing in personal immortality and the beginning of the universe. And he would just motivate that the past had a beginning with an argument that didn't rule out the endless future, like Hedrick's apparently. Then you have to explain why my symmetry argument, my symmetry reworking of Hedrick's argument doesn't land him right back into trouble again. But that would be different. At least we would know what he was doing with this trilemma, which was that he'd be denying premise 2, he'll point 2. But he's not saying that explicitly, so I'm putting a lot of words in his mouth there. So I think that it's reasonable for me to say that this just sounds like it's an irrelevant response. What about Loke? He says next. Well, he says, this is Craig, Alex's response to Loke involves an illicit modal operator shift. Alex thinks that if God can bring about the existence of every future room in an endless series of events, then he can bring about the existence of all of them in the present moment. This is a mistake. It does not follow from God's ability to bring about the present existence of any particular future room that he's able to bring about the existence of all of the future rooms. So to reason is modally logically fallacious. Thus, Loke is quite justified in denying that the possibility of an endless future implies the possibility of the existence of an actually infinite number of things, as does the possibility of a beginningless past. A bit of a mouthful in all of that. I think it was like borderline meme-ish when Craig said that something in the debate said something like, I've seen on your blogs and whatnot that you make lots of modal operator fallacies or something. And anyway, so this is him sort of doubling down on that critique. So in order to explain what Craig is saying here, I think there's a lot of context that's taken for granted. So let's take a step back and have a look at what Andrew Loke said. And this is a quote from his reply paper to Hedrick. So his paper is No Heartbreak at Hilbert's Hotel, a reply to London Hedrick, which I guess is a pun, but it's really just the name of Hedrick's paper with the word no in front of it. But anyway, it's all the same pun. Anyway, it's better that is a pun. And yeah, I couldn't find this, on Phil papers. All the other papers I've got on here, I've like snipped the Phil papers citation stuff for it. This one I could only find on JSTOR. I don't know why it's not on his Phil papers page. So Loke, if you ever hear this, update your Phil papers profile because it's missing this paper. Okay, so here's Loke. He says, suppose this is how Hilbert's Hotel is constructed. There exists a hotel room builder who's been building hotel rooms at regular time intervals as long as time exists. Suppose that the hotel rooms continue existing after they've been built and generated. Now, if the actual world is one in which the universe is past eternal, then there would have been an actual infinite number of time intervals, an actual infinite number of hotel rooms. In other words, if the actual world were one in which the universe is past eternal, then there would be a world in which an actually infinite number of things have been actualized. So I've simplified that very slightly, only because he also talks about making rooms and making guests that go in the rooms, but it doesn't actually change anything. You could just talk about the guests or the rooms. I think it doesn't matter to have both. Here's what he's saying in a syllogism, sort of simple syllogistic form. He does actually put it in a syllogism a bit like this. Again, I've simplified it very slightly, but I think charitably it doesn't make any difference. It is slightly different wording from his, but I don't think I'm doing it in order to sort of gain an advantage or anything, just for clarity. It just runs like this. If time had no beginning, then a Hilbert's Hotel would be metaphysically possible. Premise 2, a Hilbert's Hotel is metaphysically impossible. Therefore, time has a beginning. Right? So why does he think premise 1 is true? He thinks premise 1 is true because if time had no beginning, then it could be that somebody had made a unique hotel room on every past, say, day or past year, running back into the past. But if someone had made a hotel room on each and every day in the past, there'd be a Hilbert's Hotel today. But there couldn't be a Hilbert's Hotel today. Why? Because Hilbert's Hotel is metaphysically impossible, because it's absurd, because of the pulling apart of the whole notion of quantity and the cardinal notion of number. Right? That's why you think premise 2 is true. But therefore time has a beginning. So he's basically just saying, like, if time had no beginning, if it was a container big enough, you could fill it with people making hotel rooms in every day in the past. then if you could do that, then Hilbert's hotel would be possible, but it isn't. So then the past can't be a container that big. So in the paper, going back to what me and Wes actually said about this, so that's what Loke was saying. Here's what we said about what Loke was saying. We start off by asking a question, right? Could the hotel room builder, which is obviously supposed to be God, could God make infinitely many hotel rooms all in one go? Right? Could he just sort of click his fingers and say, let there be infinitely many hotel rooms right now? Well, you don't want to say that he could, because if you say that, then you run into this argument, right? Premise one, God can make an infinite hotel in one go. But an infinite hotel is impossible. Therefore, God cannot exist. Right? So it's just saying something like, I've written if P then possibly Q. I mean something like, if God could make an infinite hotel, then it's possible that there'd be an infinite hotel. Premise two is it's impossible that there's an infinite hotel, therefore it's impossible that God could make... sorry, let me start again. My rendition over here, I'm confusing myself. I'm saying if God exists, then he could make an infinite hotel in one go. But it's impossible that there's an infinite hotel, therefore it's impossible that God exists. So the problem is that if you think God has the power to make Hilbert's hotel, and you think that it's not possible for there to be a Hilbert's hotel, that's just a reductio of God existing. Right? It just means that God couldn't exist. That's like the paradox of the rock. If you say, if it's possible that God could make a rock so big that he couldn't lift it, but it's not possible that there could be a rock so big that God couldn't lift it, then it's a reductio of God existing. It means that God couldn't exist. So it's effectively the paradox of the stone. This isn't a refutation of what Loke just said a moment ago. It's just to sort of establish the standard response to the paradox of the rock is relevant here. So the standard thing to think is that you would just deny that God can make an infinite hotel all in one go, right? You don't have to say that, like with the response to the paradox of the stone, that doesn't mean that God isn't omnipotent. You can say that he's still omnipotent, but just remind us that omnipotence means that God can do everything that's metaphysically possible, but he can't do anything that's metaphysically impossible, right? So if a stone that's so heavy that God couldn't lift it is just a metaphysically impossible object, then that's why it can't be made by God, because it's impossible. God can't do anything that's impossible. And similarly, if Hilbert's hotel is metaphysically impossible, and here's where this sort of applies to what Loke was saying, right? If premise two of Loke's argument was that Hilbert's hotel can't exist, then that means that Hilbert's hotel, that God can't make one all in one go, right? He can't just snap his fingers and say, let there be Hilbert's hotel. Now, God is awesomely powerful, of course, right, and can do anything that is metaphysically possible. And you'd think, well, making, one hotel room, that's metaphysically possible. And he could make, 2 hotel rooms, like all in one go. Sure, why not? He could just go, let there be 2 hotel rooms. We could say, let there be 3 hotel rooms, or any natural number of hotel rooms. He could just make that begin to exist, no problem. But what he can't do is make a Hilbert's hotel all in one go. So the distinction we draw, then, explicitly, put it exactly like this, is that, therefore, you want to say something like, God can make a hotel with n many rooms in, for any natural number n, right? So you want to say that 1 is true, but you want to deny 2, and say that it's not the case that God can make a hotel room with such that there's 1 room for every finite number n, right? And then this is a modal scope distinction, right? Because in the first one we're saying for all n it's possible that h of n, right? For all n it's possible that God makes a hotel with n many rooms in. And on the bottom we're saying it's possible that for all n h of n, right? It's possible that for every n there's a hotel with n many rooms in it, right? So this is a classic modal scope distinction. And what we were doing in the paper was advocating that, I've written that the wrong way around, ignore that then. explicitly in the paper, unlike what I just flashed up there, I'm saying the way out of the little question sort of puzzle that we posed is obviously to say God's omnipotence is restricted in the standard way to mean that he can't do anything impossible. And if that's true and Hilbert's hotel is impossible, then God's sort of at once creative capacities are limited in such a way that he can make n many rooms for any natural number n, but he can't make every natural number n all at one go, or a number of hotel rooms such that it's equal to every natural number. So he can make any finitely big hotel, but he can't make Hilbert's hotel, at least all in one go. Cool. So, it's jarring to hear Craig saying that I'm making the modal scope distinction, I'm making a fallacy of a modal scope distinction when I drew exactly the distinction clearly in the paper. We drew it clearly in the paper. It's hard to hear him saying that I'm blundering. If you remember, let's go back to what Craig said. That it's an illicit modal operatorship. Alex thinks that if God can bring about the existence of every future room in an endless series of events, then he can bring about the existence of all of them in the present moment. I'm not saying that. I'm even advocating that the person who wants to avoid the argument we brought about should themselves say that. It's, is God's creative capacities is basically finite, not infinite. We were advocating that solution. So I'm just not saying what he thinks I'm saying. But nonetheless, am I making a mistake? Well, here's the analysis of how it applies to Loke's argument in particular, so you can decide for yourself if you think that this works or not. But let's grant the thing that Craig says I was blundering, that God can only make finitely many rooms at one time. Right? Why would you grant that? Because the absurdities of Hilbert's hotel show that an actual infinite is impossible, and God can only do what's possible. Okay, well in that case, it seems to me that the setup of Loke's argument is inconsistent, because he wants us to say that God has spent infinitely many past days adding finite numbers of rooms to a hotel. So each day he could say, let there be n rooms for any natural number, and that would add that many rooms to the hotel. The second one is that Hilbert's hotel exists today in the present. And the third one is premise 2 of his argument that an actual infinite is impossible. But those three things are not consistent together. Why think that? Well, it's because if Hilbert's hotel exists today, and God didn't make it all in one go, but he only added a finite number of rooms today, then yesterday, that means Hilbert's hotel already existed, right? So he must have added, well, if say he added 7 rooms to the hotel today, that just means that yesterday there was a Hilbert's hotel, because infinite number of rooms minus 7 rooms is still infinite number, so it was already there yesterday. But this means that Loke's asking us to imagine that God added 7 rooms to Hilbert's hotel, and that Hilbert's hotel is not possible. But that just means that God couldn't do it, right? God can't add any, it's not the question of could God add infinitely many hotel rooms, it's just a question of could God add any hotel rooms to an impossible hotel? The answer is no, because that was impossible. So the premise, the assumptions of Loke's argument are mutually inconsistent. So he's contradicting himself by stating the argument. That's my view. So you can tell me if you disagree with that, if you think I'm wrong about that, or whatever, it's up to you. But clearly, Craig's not responding to that critique of what Loke said. He's just saying that I made a modal scope distinction blunder that I didn't make, because I just drew the very distinction he was saying, and I didn't advocate that one entailed the other. I was saying you should embrace one of them and deny the other one. So, yeah, he's just one step behind that, not responding to what we said. And I'm saying now what my view is, and I might be wrong about that, but Craig's not even on the same page. Getting to the end now. What about Pruss? Craig says, Alexander Pruss's version of the argument for the finitude of the past is not susceptible to the symmetry objection. Pruss's argument for the finitude of the series of past events is based on the impossibility of any event being the effect of an infinite number of causes. He shows that an event having infinitely many causes is riddled with paradox. This rules out an infinite causal regress of events, but not an endless causal progress of events, since the latter since in the latter no event is the effect of infinitely many causes. Okay, so he's talking about Alexander Pruss and the Grim Reaper paradox, and he's saying Pruss's idea is causal finitism, and that doesn't have a future tense version of it, right? It's intrinsically only about past and not about the future. Well, yeah, so Craig's saying the Grim Reaper argument cannot be formulated into a future tense equivalent. But, you know, it's not quite so clear. There's discussion in the literature about this. So Yishai Cohen in 2015 has this paper, Endless Future, Persistent Thorn in the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Also, Joe Schmid, friend of the channel, has this excellent paper in Mind recently called The End is Near, Grim Reapers and Endless Futures, where he also kicks around the idea of retensing the Grim Reaper argument so that it applies to the future instead. And it's not clear to me, you know, I think this is an open question, right? Whether how like if it's completely retensible, the Grim Reaper argument, whether there's stuff to go through there to establish that in one way or the other, whatever. Point is, Craig can't just come along and say it couldn't possibly be retensed, because there are people who argue the opposite to that. He's not engaging with that in any way, he's just saying it. So I don't know that he's able to just declare that without any justification. Seems like he should engage with this if he wants to make that sort of point. But again, like we saw with Hedrick, so what, right? Even if he was right, how does that help with the trilemma? Like, let's say that the Grim Reaper argument couldn't be retensed to be in the future tense. Does that mean that which of the following is he denying then? That the past has a beginning, that Hilbert's hotel absurdity showed an actual infinite can't exist, or that the future is endless? It's not a symmetry breaker in the sense it's relevant, so it's just saying here's an argument for the finitude of the past. So just like with Hedrick, okay, you know, if you want to say that the Hilbert's hotel absurdities don't show an actual infinite can't exist, abandon that argument and then endorse the Grim Reaper argument instead, then fine, I guess, but at least say that. Otherwise it's not clear that, you know, it just seems like this is exactly like with Hedrick, it's just kind of changing subject. And anyway, if he wants to talk about the Grim Reaper paradox, he brought that up when we discussed it, and I had to say, you know, I'm still thinking about this argument, but since then, me and Dan and Joe have written a lot of stuff, and Joe's written even more stuff about it as well, and Troy, Dana and Joe have written together. I mean, I don't know, there's a whole load of stuff on the Grim Reaper argument these days, and I'd be happy to just talk about that if that was like the third philosophical argument that Craig wants to give as well. You know, let's talk about that. But strictly speaking, it's not relevant as a response to the symmetry argument. Okay, we are finally at the conclusion now. So let me just sum up quickly. My claim is the symmetry argument has not been addressed by Craig. None of the things he says has like really any force. I think they're all just either wrong or irrelevant. So let's go through it quickly. It's ad hominem or question begging. He said that it's ad hominem, and that's true, but it's just a classification of the argument, and it's not an objection or anything. And he tried to say it was question begging, but I just don't think it is. He's then offered the appeal to presentism. You know, the future doesn't exist. That doesn't actually help. He tried to say that the future was a potential infinite, but it's not. Some version of the past is a potential infinite. You know, and anyway, we already said those critiques of those responses that he normally says, and it's like he just ignored it, forgot it or something. So it cannot be considered a response to what we said. You know, just repeating yourself isn't a response. And then he said, what about Hedrick? But that argument can plainly be retensed. So what he said about Hedrick was false, but also it doesn't matter because it doesn't respond to the trilemma. He said, what about Loke? Again, he's just wrong when he said that I made a blunder. In any case, he's not even addressing what we do say about Loke there. I mean, again, I could just repeat myself. What's that got to do with the trilemma anyway? And again, with Pruss, you know, even if that's right, it's irrelevant. So that's what I think about that. I've been talking for a long time. My voice is starting to go. So let me stop sharing and get back to the stream. Okay, now, does anyone want to ask any questions now before we get to, before I go to bed? Does Hilbert fall to Reaper if no guest can move into an adjacent room until one before them has? Then the same fate as the Grim Reaper paradox. If no one can go into the next room, so if person in room number 1 can't go into room number 2 until the person in room number 2 has moved into room number 3, right? So I think nothing would happen in that scenario. I think nobody would move rooms. They would all just stand there waiting for room to appear, and it wouldn't. So who will be hosting the debate? Asks Bardo. It's a guy that, let me see if I remember. I met him at one of Phil's garden parties, a nice chap who's, I guess, working with Unbelievable now. John Nelson is the guy who's hosting the debate. So it's going to be on the Unbelievable show, filmed, I think, these days. And yeah, he'll be hosting it. So he's a nice chap. I think he's involved with the C.S. Lewis society or something. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Richard. All right, cool. What's my favorite temporal paradox? I don't know, maybe the Grim Reaper. It certainly caught my attention for a long time. Okay, I think I might just call it a day because I'm tired, but you know what to do. Subscribe to the channel, try and build the channel a bit. Thanks for watching if you've sat through this whole thing, or if you're now falling to sleep because it's been that dry. Cool, thanks anyway. But leave me a comment if you want to help me out. Subscribe, that type of stuff. And I will be back in 7 days. We'll do another one. Not quite sure what I'll do yet. Might talk to Dan again about the causal principle. If you want to suggest Kalam argument, sub-argument things, chuck a comment. I pretty much read the comments. So yeah, and if you think I got something wrong in this, let me know, and all that good stuff. So nice one. I call it a day there. Thank you very much.